Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
All right, we are going to be reading, as you know, Domenico Losurdo's History and Critique of a Black Legend. This is published by Iskra Books. If you would like a copy for yourself to read along with, you can, of course, type !reading in my chat, and you will get a link to it. I prefer physical books when I'm reading, but, you know, it's nice that there is so many important works being put as free PDFs, especially by Iskra Books. Everybody say thank you, Iskra. Here we go. Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. Domenico Losurdo. Afterwards by Lucanio Canfora, translated by Henry Hakamaki and Salvatore Angel de Mauro. "5 years after Ninmo's sudden passing, one of his strangest intentions comes true. The translation into English of his most heartfelt and controversial book on the figure of Stalin. The Losurdo family, myself, and my mother Ute Brielmeier, who was Ninmo's lifelong companion and tireless translator of a large part of his works into German, can only express deep gratitude to the publishing house Iskra Books, and to Henry Hakamaki and Salvatore Angel de Mauro for their competent, rigorous, and balanced translation. With the hope that this book may contribute to the dissemination of Ninmo's thoughts, ideas, and categories, inspiring the path of our young scholars. Federico Losurdo, July 2023. I'm not sure what the title, honestly. Maybe we'll find out. So, these chapters, like I say, this is a very detailed analysis. We're starting with the Khrushchev report. The history of the Bolsheviks is dealt with here. between 20th century and the longue durée, between the history of Marxism and the history of Russia. Complex and contradictory course of the Stalin era. The erasure of history and construction of mythology, Stalin and Hitler as twin monsters. Well, me personally, I'm like most. I guess I mostly would be most accurately described as like a Marxist-Leninist. Only one of the correct ones with the correct understanding of colonialism and settler colonialism. Image of Stalin, demonization, and afterward. Got a long ass book ahead of us. Forward. Henry Hakamaki and Salvatore Engel de Maro. Born in the Olive Grove, endowed in town in Senecantro di Bari in 1941, the political philosopher and prolific scholar Domenico Losurdo departed our world in 2018 when a tumor took his life. With more than 50 books published since the early 1980s, he had been in the midst of completing what may have been a triptych on the history and future of communism. The first volume, published in Italian in 2017 and not yet available in English, was a critical reassessment and rethinking of the history of Western Marxism, its failures, fragmentation, derailments, and possible futures. Western Marxism, how it was born, how it died, how it can be reborn. In the volume, he exposed the politically self-neutralizing Eurocentrism underlying Western Marxism, dismissals of or animosity towards Marxist success in the East. What would have been the sequel was published posthumously in 2021. The Question of Communism, History and Future of an Idea. In that work, Western Marxism still featured as part of the analysis, but as just one among diverse currents. He traced communism's evolution in comparison with different variants of socialism, including the more recent ecologically mindful versions. But his lens was much wider, studying communist movements as part of a totality of communist politics, transformed by and bringing about shifts in global social tendencies. As Giorgio Grimaldi mentions in the preface to La Question Comunista, Losurdo had already started publishing to some extent on the third theme on the prospects for communism as a movement and future society. It was centered on the People's Republic of China. Losurdo's work in that direction can be argued to be present already in his 2005 volume comparing the Russian and Chinese revolutions. Escape from History? The Russian and Chinese revolutions today. But his trajectory relative to the above mentioned implicit triptych was evident in an article that appeared in International Critical Thought in 2017. There, Losurdo acknowledged the great strides made in the People's Republic of China and saw Deng reforms as being in continuity with the aims of the preceding Mao government and with the historical progress made by the communist movements in general. Has China turned to capitalism? Reflections on the transition from capitalism to socialism. The tumor that shortened his life deprived us of much needed intellectual and political incisiveness and clarity on this moment of potentially grave danger to the People's Republic of China from the intensifying belligerence of imperial countries headed by the United States. At the same time, there is great confusion and periodical thinking among Western leftists over the situation in the People's Republic of China and the world more generally. Losurdo would have doubtless contributed valuable insights to help us wade through the present challenges. A staunch and unflinching Marxist, he never tired of exposing the fatal flaws in all currents of liberal thought. The ideological bulwark of capitalism. See his liberalism, a counter-history. Likewise, he has been among the few within liberal democracies to demolish the prevailing disinformation on socialist states, including within the Western left. These two of the varied aspects of his lifetime's work have made him a controversial figure in leftist circles, including communist ones, in core capitalist countries. This has been particularly so regarding Losurdo's perceived or alleged support for Stalin, a historical figure frequently used by most Western leftists as a litmus test for faithfulness to democratic principles, or as a way to silence critical support or even any serious discussion about socialist states. These matters comprise to a large degree what motivates this translation, since Losurdo's assessment of Stalin is yet to be widely available in English. We also animated by a concern that Losurdo's great achievements will be reduced to the Anglosphere worlds to a matter of where one stands relative to the Stalin question. Losurdo's work and political activism span such a large range of themes: Western Marxism, Gramsci, Lucas, Heidegger, Hegel, Nietzsche, imperialism, liberalism, revolution, class struggle, peace, racism, and provides such an inordinate magnitude of insights for a single intellectual that any dismissiveness towards his work would be unconscionable. Still, the prevalent rejection of or dismissiveness about Stalin as a historical figure merits closer and critical inspection, which is what Losurdo's Stalin provides. We encourage readers to make up their own mind on Losurdo's take on Stalin, rather than uncritically accept received notions. In fact, it is precisely how now widespread caricatures of Stalin as personified evil, rife with liberal democracies and uncritically accepted by most Western leftists, that Losurdo shows to be more related to contingent ruling class preoccupations than actual evidence. Even pointing out such problems with conventional representations of Stalin brought a shower of accusations of Stalinism or neo-Stalinism upon Losurdo, who made it clear that Stalin is not a rehabilitation, but a contribution to contextualizing and ending the demonization of Stalin, who was even praised by Gandhi in 1946. We would also add, to build on Losurdo's historical analysis of representations of Stalin, that W.E.B. Du Bois, among many, was calling Stalin a great man in an obituary in the National Guardian. Losurdo's work on the historical representations of Stalin, as well as other works like it, is perhaps more vital today than it ever has been. With the passage of time, we've become further removed from the contemporary voices challenging the construction of what has become the hegemonic view of Stalin. These counter-hegemonic narratives have effectively been swept under the rug by the ruling ideological overlords and the media apparatuses they maintain and sustain, smothering any and all alternatives and more constructive narratives. The hegemonic view has been embraced by all anti-communist liberal conservative axis. And their constructed mythology, Stalin, is weaponized consistently to bolster the anti-communism and fascism we see globally. Excessive detention and punishment is always compared to Stalin's Gulag, despite the contemporary United States having the largest prison population in world history. Its practices of extraordinary rendition and operating torture facilities worldwide for threats of the state in lieu of holding a trial. Enforced hunger as a tactic of terror is always compared to the Holodomor, despite scholars, as fervent in their anti-communism as Kotkin, conceding that the famine in question was not intentional or engineered, or that actual engineered and genocidal famines had been carried out numerous times by the likes of the British government, who, lest we forget, willfully condemned 3 million Bengalis to starvation in 1943 to 45. The suppression of political opposition is always compared to Stalin's totalitarianism. Whereas a more relevant contemporary example might be the current Ukrainian government, outlawing not only the Communist Party of Ukraine, but dozens of other parties that are left-wing, left-adjacent, or simply not in favor of the post-2014 political regime in place. The list of projections for the historical horrors of liberal democratic regimes goes on. Not only is the temporality of Losurdo's work critical, but his committed historical materialist approach to history is no less crucial. Without maintaining this principled analytical framework, there is a tendency to judge past actions on either utopian grounds or through the lens of present conditions. This is no less true for the case of the Stalin administration, who faced pressures and challenges few today can appreciate without a deep understanding of the material conditions under which they were forced to operate. The outcomes and deeds are incomprehensible without appraising the conditions that led to them. Losurdo does us the service of contextualizing these material conditions and orienting the Stalin administration's actions and decisions in relation to them, as well as in relation to similar events outside of the world's first socialist experiment. Far from hagiography, Losurdo Stalin provides a tool for breaking free of that hegemonic narrative we have all been inundated with, and for combating lazy anti-communist tropes that utilize the name Stalin as a byword for all things evil in the world. This reductive approach does not allow any grasp of what happened and why, and does nothing to help build strategies to avoid or preempt future harmful outcomes. Critical engagement here is then of utmost necessity. Losurdo's work opens a constructive way to reevaluate those 29 years under the Stalin government, which shaped not only the USSR's contradictory forms of development, for better and worse, but also the subsequent socialist revolutions that succeeded elsewhere in the world. A lot is at stake. The current hegemonic narrative impedes the capacity to learn from what went wrong, to recognize what went well, and therefore hampers our collective ability to prepare better for the chaos and horrors that capitalist states will stoke or directly inflict on future revolutions. one may remain critical of, if not inimical to Stalin or what he stood for. But that need not translate into yielding even more ruling class ideology and denying the struggles for a better society and the consequent impressive and lasting achievements of millions of people under Stalin's formal leadership in the USSR. Among such achievements were the steady improvements of living standards for all, in such forms as effective sanitation infrastructure for the majority, secure jobs, guaranteed housing, the eventual defeat of the threat of famine, and on the environmental side, the unprecedented and massive expansion of ecological protection areas, successful long-term afforestation and soil conservation, effective and increased biodiversity conservation, and much else. To erase all that would be as justifiable as erasing all the mistakes and terrible outcomes from the Stalin administration and the external mass murderous attacks on USSR by capitalist regimes. Whether liberal, democratic, fascist, or monarchist. Losurdo teaches us, among other things, that historical contextualization and coval comparisons are crucial to testing one's political philosophy and principles, to deepening our knowledge of socialist history, and at the same time, a key to dismantling bourgeois ideologies. Lamentably, many of his works remain untranslated, and this effort will hopefully stimulate the translation of further works that committed deep and forward-thinking scholar. Translator's note. This text has been carefully translated from the original Italian, with references made to and debts owed to other existing English translations by David Ferreira, the Portuguese edition, and Antonio Anton Fernandez, the Spanish edition. In an effort to maintain faithful to the original work, we have, throughout the text, maintained Losurdo's notation system, as well as the in-text citations and reference list style, with only minor alteration for ease of translation and accessibility where applicable. If you put your cat as an emote on BTTV, I will add it to the channel, Julia. There is a way you can do it. Comrades can help you. Editor's note. Quotations have been checked as far as possible against existing original texts in the case of English sources, or against official or widely accepted translations in other cases. Where grammatical, spelling, and stylistical choices differ, original formatting has been preserved in quotations. In Losurdo's original text, the many citations were included as endnotes in the rear of the text. For ease of reference and to encourage further exploration of the sources, we've chosen to include them here as footnotes. In addition to the citations, many comments are Losurdo's own, except for occasional editorial notes to aid understanding, in the form of footnotes or square bracketed inserts, which will be prefaced by editor's note. Salute to Comrade Losurdo, everybody. Yeah, well, I feel that, Epic, but that's, on this channel we sort of reject that and we study we study all of it, everything from DPRK works. Tuesdays we read Juche works. Thursdays, right now we're reading about Stalin, then we're going to be reading on Thursdays Stalin's actual works once we sort of unpack a bunch of the bullshit. All right, introduction. The turning point in the history of the image of Stalin. From the Cold War to the Khrushchev Report. Okay, Julia, thank you so much for hanging out. Again, I very much appreciate making an account just to hang out with the comrades. Very much appreciate you coming, make an account just for us, and welcome, welcome. We hope you enjoy your time here. Safe travels, comrade. From the Cold War to the Khrushchev Report. Huge demonstrations of grief accompanied Stalin's death. During his final moments, millions of people crowded into the center of Moscow to pay their last respects to the dying leader. On March 5th, 1953, millions of citizens felt his death as a personal loss. The same reaction occurred in the most remote corners of the immense country. For example, in a small village, which, as soon as it was informed of the event, fell into a spontaneous and communal mourning. The general dismay spread well beyond the borders of the USSR. Men and women wept in the streets of Budapest and Prague. Thousands of kilometers from the socialist camp, even in Israel, there was widespread outpouring of condolence. Quote, all the members of the Mampam, without exception, and it was the party to which all the initial leaders and almost all the fighters belonged. Grief was intertwined with dismay. The sun has set, the newspaper of the kibbutz movement, Al Hamshir, headlined. These feelings were for some time shared by leading figures of the state and military apparatus. 90 officers of those who had participated in the war in 1948, the Great War of Independence of the Jews, joined a clandestine armed pro-Soviet as well as pro-Stalinist and revolutionary organization. Of these, 11 later became general and 1 minister, and are still honored as fathers of the homeland of Israel. In the West, it was not only the leaders and militants of the Communist parties linked to the Soviet Union who paid tribute to the deceased leader. One historian, Isaac Ducher, who was also a fervent admirer of Trotsky, wrote an obituary full of accolades. Quote, within 3 decades, the face of the Soviet Union has completely transformed. The crux of the historical action of Stalinism is this. It had found Russia working the land with wooden plows, and leaves it master of the atomic bomb. It raised Russia to the status of the second industrial power in the world, and it was not just a matter of pure and simple material progress and organization. Such a result could not have been achieved without a vast cultural revolution, in the course of which an entire country was sent to school to impart onto it an extensive education. Unquote. Again, written by a Trotskyist. So he's going to quote a whole bunch of people that should be opponents of Stalin, as we'll see. In his conclusion, although conditioned and partly disfigured by the Asiatic and despotic legacy of Tsarist Russia, in Stalin's USSR, the socialist ideal had its innate compact integrity, quote unquote. In this historical balance sheet, there was no longer any place for the fierce accusations made by Trotsky against the late leader. What was the point of condemning Stalin as a traitor to the ideal of the world revolution, and as a capitulating theorist of socialism in one country, at a time when the new social order was expanding in Europe and Asia, and the revolution was breaking out of its national shell? Laughed at by Trotsky as a minor provincial man, oh, sorry. I forgot. I'm supposed to do a Trotsky voice, aren't I? Laughed at by Trotsky as a minor provincial man, transferred as a joke of history to the plane of great world events. By 1950, Stalin had risen. In the eyes of the illustrious philosopher, Alexandro Kojev, to the incarceration of Hegelian world spirit, and had thereby been called to unify and direct humanity, resorting, if necessary, to energetic methods, and combining in both action, wisdom, and tyranny. That's by Kojev. Outside communist circles, or the pro-communist left, despite the raging Cold War, and the dragging out of the hot war in Korea, Stalin's death prompted obituaries in the West that were, on the whole, respectful or balanced. Hey Sebs, welcome in. So great to see you on your account. Trotsky just wanted Lenin's bussy, so he was jealous of Stalin. There you go. Sebs knows what's up. Everybody follow our comrade Sebs, please. So good to see you back on your account. I saw you streaming a couple times. I lurked, but I was streaming. I hope you're well, comrade. At that time, he was still seen as a relatively benign dictator, as a statesman even. And in popular consciousness, an affectionate memory lingered of Uncle Joe, the great war leader who had led his people to victory over Hitler and helped save Europe from Nazi barbarism. The ideas, impressions, and emotions of the years of the Grand Alliance against the Third Reich and its allies had not yet disappeared. When, as Ducher recalled in 1948, quote, foreign statesmen and generals were impressed by Stalin's extraordinary grasp of the technical details of his gigantic war machine, unquote. Among the personalities who were favorably affected was one who, in his time, had indeed promoted military intervention against the country that emerged from the October Revolution. Winston fucking Churchill, who had repeatedly said about Stalin, quote, I like that man. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, the British statesman had greeted his Soviet colleague as Stalin the Great, quote unquote. He was the worthy heir of Peter the Great. He had saved his country by enabling it to defeat the invaders. Fascinated as well was Averell Harriman, U.S. ambassador to Moscow between 1943 and 1946, who always drew a very flattering portrait of the Soviet leader on the military level. I found him better informed than Roosevelt, more realistic than Churchill, and in some ways more effective of the war leaders. In 1994, Alcide de Gasperi expressed himself, even more emphatic terms, celebrating the, quote, immense historical enduring merit of the armies organized by the genius of Joseph Stalin, unquote. Nor were the recognitions of the eminent Italian politician limited to purely a military level. Quote, when I saw that Hitler and Mussolini persecuted people for their race and invented this terrible anti-Jewish legislation, we know. And at the same time, we saw how the Russians, composed of 160 different ethnicities, sought to fuse them together, overcoming the differences between Asia and Europe. This effort towards unification of human society, let me say, this is Christian. This is eminently universalist in the sense of Catholicism, unquote. No less strong and no less widespread was the prestige Stalin enjoyed and continued to enjoy among the great intellectuals. Harold J. Lasky, who is a prestigious exponent of the English Labour Party, conversing in the fall of 1945 with Norberto Bobbio, had declared himself an admirer of the Soviet Union, and its leader, whom he called très sage, very wise, In that same year, Hannah Arendt wrote that the country led by Stalin had distinguished itself for, quote, its entirely new and successful approach to nationality conflicts, its new form of organizing different people on the basis of national equality, unquote. It was a sort of model, something to which every political and national movement should give its utmost attention. Like I said, he quotes a lot of people here in this introduction that we don't like, for the purpose of proving that even those who should have hated Stalin had to admit some things. In turn, writing shortly before and shortly after the end of the Second World War, Benedetto Croce had acknowledged Stalin's merit of having promoted freedom not only on an international level, thanks to his contribution to the fight against Nazi fascism, but also in his own country. Yes, directing the USSR was a man of gifted political genius, who carried out an overall positive historical function. Compared to pre-revolutionary Russia, Sovietism was a progress towards freedom, just as, in relation to the feudal regime, even an absolute monarchy was a progress towards freedom, and allowed the further and greater progress that followed. The liberal philosophers' doubts focused on the future of the Soviet Union, but by contrast, they made Stalin's greatness stand out even more. He had taken Lenin's place, so that one genius had been followed by another. But from here on, what successors did Providence reserve for the USSR? Ah, and herein lies the tragedy. Those who, as the crisis of the Grand Alliance unfolded, had begun to compare Stalin's Soviet Union with Hitler's Germany were harshly rebuked by Thomas Mann. What characterized the Third Reich was the racial megalomania, the self-styled master race, who had implemented a diabolical policy of depopulation. And even before that was the eradication of culture of the conquered. Hitler had thus adhered to Nietzsche's maximum. Quote, if one wants slaves, then one is a fool. If one wants to educate them to be masters. Directly opposite was the orientation of Russia's socialism, which, by massively spreading education and culture, had shown that it did not want slaves, but thinking people, and therefore to be in spite of everything on the path towards freedom. It was then unacceptable to compare the two regimes. On the contrary, those who argued this way could be suspected of complicity with fascism, which they also claimed they wanted to condemn. To place Russian communism and Nazi fascism on the same moral plane, in that both would be totalitarian, is superficial at best, fascism at worst. Whoever insists on this equation may well consider himself a Democrat. In truth, and in the bottom of his heart, he is in fact already a fascist. And certainly not only in a hypocritical and insincere way will he fight fascism, while reserving all his hatred for communism. Sound familiar? Of course, the Cold War had then broken out, and by publishing her book on totalitarianism, Arendt went on to accomplish in 1951 precisely that which had been denounced by Mann. However, almost at the same time, Kojève had pointed to Stalin as the protagonist of a decidedly progressive historical turning point of planetary dimensions. That is to say, in the West itself, the new truth, or rather the new ideological motive, of the equal struggle against the different manifestations of totalitarianism was struggling to assert itself. In 1948, Lasky had in some way reinforced the point of view he had expressed 3 years earlier, To define the USSR, he had taken up a category used by another leading exponent of the British Labour Party, Patrice Webb, who had already spoken in 1931 and had continued to speak during the Second World War. And shortly before her death, of a new civilization. Yes, Lasky had reiterated, with the formidable impulse given to the social promotion of classes that had been exploited and oppressed for so long, and with the introduction of factories and workplaces of new relationships, no longer based on the foreign power of the owners of the means of production, the country, led by Stalin, had emerged as a pioneer of new civilization. Of course, both sides were quick to point out that the new civilization that was emerging still bore the weight of barbaric Russia. It expressed itself in despotic forms, but, Lasky emphasized in particular, in order to formulate a correct judgment on the Soviet Union, it was necessary not to lose sight of an essential fact. Its leaders came to power in a country accustomed only to bloody tyranny, and were forced to govern in a situation characterized by a more or less permanent state of siege, and by a potential or ongoing war. Moreover, in situations of acute crisis, England and United States also had limited traditional freedoms more or less as drastically. Referring to the admiration expressed by Lasky towards Stalin and the country he led, Bobbio would write much later, quote, immediately after Hitler's defeat, to which the Soviets had made a decisive contribution at the Battle of Stalingrad, Lasky's statement did not make any particular impression, unquote. In reality, for the British labor intellectual, the recognition paid to the USSR and its leader went far beyond the military level. On the other hand, was the position of the aforementioned philosopher from Turin, very different at that time. In 1954, he published an essay which ascribed to the merits of the Soviet Union and the socialist states of having initiated a new phase of civil progress in politically backward countries, introducing traditional democratic institutions of formal democracy, such as universal suffrage of elected officials, and of substantial democracy such as collectivization of the means of production. It was then a matter of pouring a drop of liberal oil into the machinery of the already accomplished revolution, quote unquote. However, Disby, as can be seen, it was far from negative judgment of the country still mourning the death of Stalin. In 1954, the legacy of liberal socialism was still alive in Bobbio. While strongly emphasizing the inalienable value of freedom and democracy. During the years of the war in Spain, Carlo Rosselli had negatively contrasted the liberal countries. The government of England is for Franco, it starves Bilbao, with the Soviet Union, which was committed to helping the Spanish Republic, which had been attacked by Nazi fascism. Nor was it just about international politics. To a world characterized by the era of fascism, imperialist wars, and capitalist decadence, Carlo Rosselli had contrasted the example of a country which, although still far from the goal of mature democratic socialism, had nevertheless left capitalism behind and represented a capital of precious experiences for anyone committed to building a better society. Today, with the gigantic Russian experience, we have immense amount of positive material. We all know what it means to have socialist revolution and socialist organization of the means of production. Unquote. In conclusion, throughout a period of history, in circles that went far beyond the communist movement, the country led by Stalin, and Stalin himself, could enjoy sympathetic interest, esteem, and sometimes even admiration. Of course, there had been the serious disappointment caused by the pact with Nazi Germany. But Stalingrad had taken care of that. This is why in 1953, and in the years immediately following, the homage paid to the deceased leader that had united the socialist camp seemed at times to bring together the communist movement, despite previous divisions, and ended up somehow finding an echo in the liberal West itself, which was also engaged in a Cold War waged on both sides with no holds barred. It is no coincidence that in the speech that officially opened the Cold War at Fulton, Churchill said, quote, "I have a strong admiration and regard for the valiant Russian people and for my wartime comrade Marshal Stalin," unquote. There is no doubt that with the escalation of the Cold War, historians were gradually hardening. Yet, still in 1952, the great English historian. Tones were gradually hardening. Jesus Christ. These two being together screwed me up. Okay. There is no doubt that with the escalation of the Cold War, tones were gradually hardening. Yet, still in 1952, a great English historian, who had worked in the service of the Foreign Office, namely Arnold Toynbee, was able to compare the Soviet leader to a man of genius, Peter the Great. Yes, the tyrannical course of technological westernization followed by Stalin ended up being justified, like Peter's, by the evidence of the battlefield. Indeed, it continued to be justified even beyond the defeat inflicted on the Third Reich. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Russia again found itself having to make a forced march to bring itself up to par with a Western technology. They had again lightning fast distanced it. For an all-around comparative analysis. And so, perhaps even more so than the Cold War, it is another historical event that imprints a radical turning point on the history of Stalin's image. Churchill's speech of March 5th, 1946, plays a less relevant role than another speech. The one delivered 10 years later, on February 25th, 1956, to be exact, by Nikita Khrushchev on the occasion of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. For more than 3 decades, this report, which portrayed morbidly bloody, vain, and intellectual mediocre or even ridiculous dictator, pleased almost everyone. It allowed the new ruling group in power in the USSR to present itself as the sole repository of the revolutionary legitimacy within the country. The socialist camp and the international communist movement, which saw Moscow as its center. Strengthened in its old convictions and with new arguments at the disposal to conduct the Cold War, the West also had reasons to be satisfied, even enthusiastic. In the United States, Sovietology had tended to develop around the CIA and other military and intelligence agencies. After the removal of elements suspected of harboring sympathies for the country that had emerged from the October Revolution, a process of transformation had begun to take place in the United States. In 1949, the president of the American Historical Association declared, quote, "One cannot afford to be orthodox. Plurality of aims and values is no longer allowed. It is necessary to accept a large measure of regimentation, total war, whether it be hot or cold, enlists everyone to calls upon everyone to assume this part. The historian is no freer from this obligation than the physicist." Unquote. Jesus. All this does not dissipate in 1956. But now, a more or less militarized Sovietology can enjoy the comfort coming from within the communist world itself. It is true that more than communism as such, the Khrushchev report put a single personality in a state of accusation. But in those years it was opportune, even from the point of view of Washington and its allies, not to widen the target too much and concentrate the fire on Stalin's country. With the signing of the Balkan Pact in 1953, with Turkey and Greece, Yugoslavia became a sort of external member of NATO. And about 20 years later, China also stipulated with the US a de facto alliance against the Soviet Union. It is this superpower that is to be isolated and is pressured to proceed to an increasingly radical de-Stalinization until it is deprived of any form of identity and self-esteem and resigned to capitulation and final dissolution. Finally, thanks to the revelations coming from Moscow, the great intellectuals could easily forget or erase the interest, the sympathy, and even the admiration with which they had looked at the Stalinist USSR. In particular, those revelations gave comfort to the intellectuals who had Trotsky as their point of reference. For a long time, it had been Trotsky himself who, in the eyes of the enemies of the Soviet Union, embodied the infamy of communism and represented, in a privileged way, the exterminator, or rather, the Jewish exterminator, quote unquote. Even in 1933, when he had already been in exile for some years, in the eyes of Spengler, Trotsky continued to represent Bolshevist mass murder. Beginning with the turning point of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the USSR, it was only Stalin and his closest collaborators who were confirmed to the Museum of Horrors. Who were confined to the Museum of Horrors. Above all, by exerting its influence far beyond the circle of Trotskyists, the Khrushchev report had a consolatory function for the circles of certain Marxist left, who thus felt exempt from the painful obligation to rethink the master's theory and the history and the effects it actually had. Far from disappearing, national identities played an increasingly important role in the conflicts that would lead up to the splitting and eventual collapse of the socialist camp. There was no sign of overcoming money or the market, which, if anything, tended to expand with economic development. Yes, all this was indisputable, but the fault was Stalin and Stalinism, and so there was no reason to question the hopes or certainties that had accompanied the Bolshevik Revolution and referred back to Marx. Although starting from the opposition positions, these political ideological currents produced their image of Stalin out of a colossal, arbitrary abstractions. On the left, they proceeded to the virtual erasure from the history of Bolshevism, and even more so from the history of Marxism, of a man who, longer than any other leader, had exercised power in the country resulting from the revolution prepared and conducted by referring to the ideas of Marx and Engels. In turn, the anti-communists casually glossed over both the history of the Tsarist Russia and the Second 30 Years' War, in the context of which the contradictory and tragic development of Soviet Russia and Stalin's three decades is placed. And so, each of the different political ideological currents took their cue from Khrushchev's speech to cultivate their own mythology, whether it was the purity of the West or the purity of Marxism and Bolshevism. Stalinism was the horrible term of comparison that allowed each of the antagonists to celebrate, through opposition, their own infinite moral and intellectual superiority. Founded on very different abstractions, these readings have nevertheless ended up producing some methodological convergence. In investigating it, and without paying much attention to the objective situation, they made terror descend from the initiative of a single personality or a narrow ruling class, determined to assert its absolute power by any means. Starting from this assumption, if Stalin could be compared to another great political personality, it could only be Hitler. Consequently, for the purpose of understanding the Stalinist USSR, the only possible comparison was with Nazi Germany. This is a motif that had already appeared in Trotsky at the end of the 1930s, who repeatedly used the category of totalitarian dictatorship, to which and with in this genus distinguished on the one hand the Stalinist species and on the other the fascist, and above all Hitlerian species, using an approach that would later become common sense during the Cold War and in today's dominant ideology. Is this way of arguing persuasive? Or is it better to resort to an all-around comparative approach, without losing sight of the history of Russia as a whole, or of the Western countries involved in the Second 30 Years' War? It is true that, in this way, a comparison is made between countries and leaders with very different characteristics. But in this diversity, to be placed exclusively on the account of ideologies, or does the objective situation also play an important role? That is, the geopolitical position and the history behind each of the countries involved in the Second 30 Years' War. When we speak of Stalin, our thoughts immediately turn to the personalization of power, to the concentratory universe, to the deportation of entire ethnic groups. But do these phenomena and practices refer only to Nazi Germany as well as to the USSR? Or do they manifest themselves in different ways according to the greater or lesser acuteness of the state of exception and its more or less prolonged duration, in other countries as well, including those with more consolidated liberal tradition? Certainly, it is necessary not to lose sight of the role of ideologies, but can one ideology to which Stalin refers really be compared to that which inspired Hitler? Or does comparative analysis in this field, conducted without prejudice, end up producing completely unexpected results? Without prejudice, in spite of the theorists of purity, a political movement, a political regime, cannot be judged by relying on the excellence of the ideals it claims to be inspired by. Weird, I literally just said that earlier in this stream about social democracy. In the evaluation of these same ideals, we cannot overlook the the history of effects produced by them. But should this approach be applied to the whole field, or only to the movement that started from Lenin and Marx? Oh god. These questions appear superfluous and even misleading to those who remove the problem of the changing image of Stalin from the belief that Khrushchev would finally bring to light the truth previously concealed. However, a historian who wanted to identify 1956 as the year of the final and ultimate revelation would be demonstrating a total lack of methodological understanding, and would casually overlook the conflicts and interests that stimulated the campaign of de-Stalinization and its methods. And even before had stimulated the Sovietology of the Cold War. The radical contrast between the different images of Stalin should push the historian not to absolutize one of them, but to problematize all of them. And there we go. That's the introduction.